On 5 May 1959, an Italian newspaper published an article about a valley in the Alps. The headline said that a company was throwing its weight around and that the mountain people were defending themselves. Partway down, the writer set out a specific danger. A reservoir holding 150 million cubic meters of water was going to sit against ground that was not stable. The houses of a village called Erto, she wrote, were at risk of ending up in the lake. The writer was a journalist named Tina Merlin. She worked for a daily paper called L'Unità, and she had grown up in the province where the dam was being built. For writing that paragraph, she was charged with a crime. The charge was spreading false and tendentious news, capable of disturbing public order. The complaint that started it came from the local Carabinieri station, covering Erto and Casso, the two villages that sat on the shore of the reservoir she had described. The case went to the tribunal of Milan. 4 years later, on the night of 9 October 1963, roughly 250 million cubic meters of that mountain came down into the reservoir. The wave it pushed out went over the top of the dam and destroyed 5 settlements in the valley below. Somewhere between about 1,900 and 2,100 people died. The dam itself was almost undamaged. It is still standing today. This is the story of what happened to a warning, not what happened to a mountain, which is a question of geology, and not what happened to a wall of concrete, which turned out to be the one part of the project that worked. What happened to the warning? Where it went when it was published? Who received it? What each institution did with it? And what a court finally called it 12 years later. If you find this kind of story worth your time, subscribing helps more of them get made. Start with the charge itself, because the wording matters. Italian law at the time carried an offense covering the publication of false, exaggerated, or tendentious news that could disturb public order. It was a provision inherited from an earlier era of Italian government, and it did not require the state to prove that anybody had actually been harmed. It required the state to establish that the news was false or slanted, and that it was the kind of thing that could unsettle people. That is a particular kind of accusation to bring against a warning. It does not engage with whether the danger is real. It engages with the effect of saying so. A prosecution under that heading asks a court to rule on the temperature of a claim rather than its accuracy. It puts the person who raised the alarm in the position of defending the alarm rather than the thing that caused it. There is a second feature worth noticing. The complaint came from a police station in the affected villages. Not from the company, not from a ministry in Rome, from the Carabinieri detachment responsible for Erto and Casso, the same two places whose residents Merlin had quoted as being frightened. So the sequence in 1959 was this. Villagers were worried about the reservoir. A journalist wrote down what they were worried about and added a technical claim about unstable ground. The police in those villages treated the article as a public order problem, and the matter moved from the valley, where the mountain was, to a courtroom in Milan, where it was not. Nothing about that sequence is unusual. That is the point. It is a completely ordinary institutional response, carried out by people doing their jobs as they understood them. It is also the moment when the only formal process examining the question of whether Monte Toc was safe became a criminal trial of a reporter. Tina Merlin was 33 years old when the article appeared. She had been born in 1926 in the province of Belluno, in the mountains north of Venice, into a farming family. She finished the 3rd grade. That was the extent of her formal schooling. In 1951, she joined L'Unità by sitting a competitive examination, which is how she got the job with the education she had. The beat she covered was the one she came from. She wrote about poverty in the mountain communities, about depopulation, and about emigration, which in that part of Italy in the 1950s meant working-age people leaving the valleys for factories elsewhere and not coming back. She also wrote about what large companies were doing to mountain land, including the way the electricity concern behind the Vilhjalmur project handled expropriations in the Dolomites. This background is not decoration. It explains the specific thing she was in a position to notice. An engineer looking at Monte Toc in 1959 would have been looking at survey data, borehole logs, and stability calculations. A journalist covering land expropriation in Belluno was looking at something else. She was listening to people who had lived on that slope for generations, who had watched water do things to that particular rock for their whole lives, and who were being moved off it. Local knowledge of a mountainside is not a substitute for geology, but it is evidence, and in 1959 it was evidence that had nowhere formal to go. She wrote it down and published it, and that turned out to be the only route it had. The place she was writing about is a narrow gorge cut by the Vilhjalmur River in the southeastern Italian Alps, roughly 100 kilometers north of Venice. The gorge runs east to west. On its northern side sit the villages of Urto and Casso, small settlements built on steep ground. On its southern side rises Monte Toc, where the gorge meets the wider valley of the Piave River. Downstream and below sits the town of Longarone, along with the smaller settlements of Pirago, Rivalta, Villanova, and Faye. The geography is worth holding on to, because every part of it does work later. Urto and Casso are on the water. Longarone is below the water. The mountain that matters is on the opposite bank from the villages, facing them. Expropriations of land from mountain farmers in this area had begun in the mid-1950s, and they were resisted. People who worked small holdings on difficult ground were being required to give them up so that the ground could be flooded. Merlin's article of May 1959 came out of that conflict. Its headline is about the company throwing its weight around and the mountain people defending themselves, which tells you what the story was framed as at the time: a land dispute. The dangerous sentence was inside a land dispute story. That is how the warning entered the record, and it is part of why it was easy to categorize as agitation. The thing they were building in the gorge was, by the standards of 1959, extraordinary. The Vilhjalmur Dam is a double curvature arch dam, which means it is curved both horizontally and vertically, so that the pressure of the water behind it is carried into the rock walls of the gorge on either side rather than resisted by sheer mass. It stands 290 meters high. Its crest is 190 meters long. At its base, it is 2211 meters thick, and at the crest, it narrows to 2.92 meters. That last figure is worth pausing on. At the top, the tallest dam of its kind in the world at that time was under 3 meters wide. That is what a thin arch dam is. It is not a wall holding water back by being heavy. It is a shell transferring load sideways into the mountains. When it works, it is one of the most efficient structures in civil engineering, and the men who designed this one were very good at their jobs. Behind it was to be a reservoir. Merlin's article cited a figure of 150 million cubic meters. The design capacity of the finished reservoir is given as about 168 to 169 million cubic meters. She was in the right range, working from public information and local conversation, which is another small fact worth holding. Construction started in July 1957, and the structure was finished in September 1960. Filling of the reservoir began in February 1960, before the dam itself was complete. That overlap matters. The reservoir was being filled while the project was still being built, and the filling was not a single event. It was a series of cycles, up and down, over more than 3 years. Each cycle was a test. Each cycle was also a measurement. Merlin's trial in Milan did not move quickly. It ran into the autumn of 1960, more than a year after the article appeared. While it was running, the reservoir was going up. By March 1960, the water had reached an elevation of about 600 meters, and a small detachment of material was recorded on the slope. In May 1960, instruments detected ground movement on the northern section. The water kept rising through the summer and into the autumn. On 4 November 1960, with the reservoir at an elevation of about 645 to 650 meters, roughly 700,000 cubic meters of Monte Toc slid into the lake. That figure is small compared with what came later. It is not small in itself. 700,000 cubic meters of rock and earth entering a reservoir raised the water level by about 10 meters and sent a wave across it. Nobody was killed. The dam was not damaged. What the slide left behind was more important than what it did. Along the slope above the failure, a crack opened. It ran for around 2 kilometers in a shape that the engineers and geologists working on the site described as an M. That perimeter crack marked out the boundary of a mass of the mountain that was moving as a unit. At that point, in November 1960, the following things were all true at once and all known to the company. A journalist was on trial in Milan for writing that the ground on that slope was unstable. The ground on that slope had just proved unstable, and the shape of the crack showed roughly how much of the mountain was involved. The response was to lower the water. Between November and December 1960, the reservoir was drawn down from about 600 meters to about 600 meters. The movement slowed. That relationship between the level of the water and the behavior of the mountain is the single most important technical fact in this story. Hold on to it. Everything in the next 4 years runs through it. The proceeding itself had by then been running for about a year and a half. That interval is easy to pass over, and it should not be. From the summer of 1959 until the end of November 1960, Tina Merlin was a person under criminal charge. She continued to work, and she continued to cover the valley. She was doing so while defending herself against the state over an article about the danger at the Vilhjalmur, and while the reservoir behind that dam was being filled for the first time. The two processes ran in parallel, and neither had any effect on the other. The rising water did not pause for the trial. The trial did not require anybody to look at the rising water. The verdict in Milan came down on 30 November 1960. Tina Merlin was acquitted. The court did not acquit her on a technicality, and it did not find the question too difficult to judge. It held that the article contained nothing false, nothing exaggerated, and nothing tendentious. It held that she had exercised legitimate rights as a journalist, and it held that the concern she reported among the residents of Urto was widespread and justified by the circumstances. Take those 3 findings separately, because they do different work. The first is a finding about accuracy. The state had alleged that the article was false, exaggerated, or slanted, and the court examined the article against that allegation and rejected it on all 3 counts. That is a judicial determination that what she wrote about the Vilhjalmur was factually sound. The second is a finding about role. It holds that a journalist reporting a danger of this kind is doing the thing journalists are entitled to do. exercising that right does not become an offense because the subject is uncomfortable for a company or unsettling for the public. The third finding is the one that goes furthest, and it is easy to miss. The court held that the concern among the residents of Urto was widespread and that it was justified by the circumstances. That is not a ruling about a newspaper. It is a ruling about the mountain. To reach it, the tribunal had to form a view on whether the people living beside the Vilhjalmur Reservoir had good reason to be afraid of it, and it concluded that they did. An Italian court, in November 1960, having heard the state's case, put on the public record that fear of the Vilhjalmur Reservoir was reasonable. That finding sat in a court file in Milan for the next 3 years, while the reservoir was filled twice more, to levels 50 and then 60 meters higher than the one that had already produced a landslide. An Italian criminal court, in November 1960, examined the claim that the Vilhjalmur Reservoir endangered the people living around it, and found the claim reasonable. The acquittal is dated 26 days after the mountain moved. There is no evidence that the court decided the case because of the slide. The proceedings had been running for over a year, and the judgment addresses the article and the state of concern in the village, not the events of 4 November. But the two dates sit next to each other in the record, and their order is not in dispute. On 4 November 1960, a piece of Monte talc entered the reservoir. On 30 November 1960, a court in Milan ruled that saying such a thing might happen was neither false nor alarmist. So by the last day of November 1960, the warning had been through the whole system. It had been published. It had been prosecuted. It had been tested in open court against the state's own evidence, and it had been upheld. The reservoir was refilled twice more after that. Understanding why requires going back well before 1959, to the point where the gorge stopped being a landscape and became an asset. The Vilhjalmur Gorge had been looked at as a hydroelectric site since at least 1929, when the geologist Giorgio Dal Piaz and the engineer Carlo Semenza carried out early inspections there. What made it attractive was its shape. A deep, extremely narrow limestone canyon requires a comparatively small quantity of concrete to close, and closing it creates a reservoir with a lot of water at a great height. In hydroelectric terms, height is the product. Water high up is stored energy, and a gorge like the Vilhjalmur offers a great deal of height for very little wall. By 1940, the project had been given a name that reflected its scale. It was called the Grand Vilhjalmur, and planning accelerated under it. This was a period when Italian industry was consolidating electricity generation in the northern valleys, and the Alpine rivers were being systematically converted into a network of dams, tunnels, and power stations feeding the industrial cities of the plain. Carlo Semenza was the engineer at the center of it. He was born in Milan on 9 July 1893. He worked for the electricity concern behind the project, and over his career he designed 15 major dams. The Vilhjalmur was to be the highest of its kind in the world. It is worth being accurate about what kind of person is at the center of this. Not a corner cutter and not a fool. A distinguished engineer at the top of a demanding profession, working on the structure that would be the summit of his career, in a country rebuilding itself and hungry for power. Everything that goes wrong from here goes wrong through competent people making defensible individual decisions inside a structure that had no place to put a warning. In 1943, the project received an approval from a commission in Rome. The war was on. Members who should have been present were not, and the legally required quorum for that decision was absent. This is a small procedural fact with a long reach. so it is worth stating plainly what it does and does not mean. It does not mean the project was illegal, and it does not mean anyone was deceived. It means that the formal moment at which the state examined the Vilhjalmur scheme and said yes was a meeting that did not have enough people at it to say yes properly, held in the middle of a war about a dam that would not be built for another 14 years. The approval carried forward anyway. It became the basis on which later stages proceeded, and it established the pattern that recurs at every subsequent decision point in this story. The scrutiny is procedural rather than physical. The question being answered is whether the paperwork permits the next step, not whether the mountain permits it. There is a second consequence of that 1943 date, and it is structural rather than moral. An approval is a snapshot. It records a judgment made at a particular moment, on the basis of the information available then, about a scheme of a particular size. Everything downstream of it inherits its authority. The 1943 decision was made about a Vilhjalmur project that had not been surveyed with the techniques available in 1957, that had not yet been enlarged, and that was still nearly 15 years from breaking ground. Between the approval and the construction sat a world war, the collapse and reconstruction of the Italian state, and a complete turnover in the geological understanding of the site. None of that triggered a fresh examination of whether the scheme should exist. The permission was already in the file. That is how a concession works, and it is not a flaw peculiar to Italy or to this project. Large infrastructure needs stable permissions, because nobody will finance a 20-year scheme that can be reopened at will. The stability that makes such projects possible is the same stability that carries an old decision past the evidence that should have overturned it. The Vilhjalmur file was, in effect, a permission granted before the evidence and executed after it. In 1949, the company commissioned a further geological investigation of the site. So the geology was not ignored. It was studied, repeatedly, by qualified people over decades. The problem was never a shortage of study. The company was called Società Adriatica di Elettricità, known as SAD. It was a private electricity concern operating in northeastern Italy, and it held the concession for the Vilhjalmur scheme. A concession is a specific kind of arrangement. The state grants a private company the right to use a public resource, in this case a river and a valley, in exchange for the company building and operating the works. It creates a particular alignment of interests. The company carries the capital cost and takes the revenue. The state carries the regulatory duty and, ultimately, the population. The wider context is the Italian electricity industry of the period, and it explains why anybody was building a 261.6-meter dam in a gorge at all. Italy came out of the Second World War with its industrial base damaged and almost no domestic coal or oil. What it did have was mountains and rainfall. Northern Italy is bounded by the Alps, and the Alps deliver water at altitude, which is the raw material of hydroelectric power. Through the late 1940s and the 1950s, the country converted its alpine valleys into a generating system, with dams, tunnels, and power stations chained down the rivers. That system underwrote the Italian industrial expansion of those years. The factories of Milan and Turin ran on it. Understanding hydroelectric economics makes the Vilhjalmur decisions legible. The energy available from water is the product of two things: how much of it there is and how far it falls. Volume can be increased by building a bigger reservoir. Height can be increased by building a taller dam or by siting the reservoir further up the valley. Both were pursued at the Vilhjalmur, and the 1957 enlargement pursued both at once, by making the dam 61 meters taller and nearly tripling the stored volume. That is not a marginal improvement to a scheme. It is a substantial increase in the value of the concession, achieved by raising the surface of the water further up the sides of a gorge whose left bank was an ancient landslide. The company holding it, Società Adriatica di Elettricità, was one of the private concerns that had built and operated much of this network in the northeast. Its position was ordinary for the period. It held long-term rights over public water. It financed and built the works, and it sold the output. None of that is unusual, and none of it is inherently dangerous. What it did was establish that the height of the water in the Vajont Reservoir was, simultaneously, a measure of company revenue and a control on the stability of Monte Toc. There was no point in the arrangement at which those two functions were assigned to different people with the power to overrule each other. For the people of Urto and Casso, the practical form of that arrangement was expropriation. From the mid-1950s, farmers on the slopes above the gorge were required to give up land so that it could be flooded, or so that works could be built on it. These were small holdings on steep ground, worked by families over generations, and the compensation on offer was set against the value of marginal alpine farmland, rather than against what the land was worth to the people using it. They protested. That protest is the subject of Merlin's article, and it is the reason a journalist was standing in those villages in the spring of 1959 in the first place. The warning about the mountain reached print as a passenger inside a story about land. It is worth being concrete about what was being taken, because the phrase land expropriation carries very little weight until you know what the land was. A holding on the slopes above Erto or Casso in the 1950s was not a farm in any sense that would be recognized on the plains. It was a set of small, separated parcels on steep ground, some of it cleared by hand generations earlier, worked for hay, for a few animals, for potatoes and rye. The value of such a holding does not sit in its market price, which is low, because nobody buys marginal alpine terraces as an investment. The value sits in the fact that the household depends on it and cannot replace it. Compensation in an expropriation is calculated against market value. That is the ordinary rule, and there is nothing sinister in it. What it means in this specific setting is that a family being paid the market price of a steep hectare above a gorge was being paid a sum that could not buy them an equivalent living anywhere. The transaction was legal, it was properly conducted, and it converted a subsistence into a payment. This is also the period in which those same valleys were losing people. Merlin's regular subject was depopulation and emigration, which in the Belluno Mountains in the 1950s meant working-age people leaving for factory work elsewhere and not returning. The expropriations ran alongside that, and in the same direction. So when residents of Urto and Casso said the reservoir was dangerous, they were saying it from a position that made them easy to discount. They were poor. They were losing an argument about land. They had an obvious material interest in the project not proceeding, and they had no technical credentials of any kind. Every one of those facts is true. None of them bears on whether the mountain was moving. That is the trap the warning was caught in from the beginning. The people best placed to notice were the people with the least standing to be believed, and the fact that they were also fighting the project on other grounds made their observation look like a tactic. Then, on 15 June 1957, the project changed size. According to the French state accident analysis of the disaster, the operator had originally sought approval for a reservoir of 58 million cubic meters. In 1957, it applied to enlarge that to 169 million cubic meters, which required raising the dam by 61 meters. That approval was granted on 15 June 1957. Look at the ratio. The reservoir was not increased by a third or by half. It was nearly tripled, and the way they tripled it was to make the wall 61 meters taller. That raises the water surface far up the sides of the gorge and puts it against a great deal of slope the original scheme would never have touched. The same French analysis records that the 1957 permit application did not carry official authorization for the initial earthworks. Construction began in July 1957. Nothing in the record suggests that anyone enlarging the reservoir in 1957 believed they were creating the conditions for what happened in 1963. What the enlargement did was change which parts of Monte Toc would be underwater. The slope that failed in 1963 is slope that a 58 million cubic meter reservoir would not have reached. The rock of the Vilhjalmur Gorge is limestone, and limestone is the reason all of this is happening in that particular place. The bedrock there consists of limestone and marly limestone, laid down in the Upper Jurassic and through the Lower and Upper Cretaceous, which is to say, between roughly 160 million and 70 million years ago, when the region was seabed. It was later lifted and folded into the Alps. Limestone has a property that no other common building rock shares to the same degree. It dissolves. Rainwater picks up carbon dioxide from the air and the soil and becomes mildly acidic, and mildly acidic water eats calcium carbonate. Over long periods, this produces the landscape geologists call karst, which is a terrain of caves, sinkholes, underground rivers, and deep, narrow gorges, formed because the water is not only carrying rock away mechanically, but taking it into solution. That is how you get a canyon like the Vilhjalmur. A river running on limestone can cut a slot far narrower and far deeper than the same river running on granite. For a dam builder in the middle of the 20th century, that slot is close to ideal. The whole cost of an arch dam is in the width of the gap you have to close. A narrow gorge with high rock walls lets you build a comparatively small structure and impound a very large volume of water at a very great height. The Vilhjalmur Gorge offered a gap of 190 meters at the crest for a structure 261.6 meters tall. That ratio is what made the project worth pursuing for 30 years. The same rock carries the problem. Limestone in the Alps is bedded. It was deposited in layers, and those layers were subsequently tilted. Where the bedding planes dip toward the valley, as they do on the left bank of the Vilhjalmur, the mountain is effectively built out of sheets leaning downhill. The strength of that arrangement depends heavily on what is between the sheets. At the Vilhjalmur, what is between some of them is clay. The 2025 research review identifies the failure surface as sitting predominantly within a rock unit called the Fonsasso Formation, and specifically within cherty limestone layers interleaved with lenses of clay. Chert is hard, brittle silica. Clay is the opposite. It is weak, it holds water, and once it has been sheared, it does not recover its original strength. Clay that has already slid is permanently weaker than clay that has not. So the left bank of the Vilhjalmur Gorge was a stack of dipping limestone sheets with weak, water-sensitive layers between some of them, leaning toward a valley that was about to be filled with 169 million cubic meters of water. The French state analysis describes the resulting sliding surface as chair-shaped, following curved bedding, with a steeper section above and a flatter section below. Picture a seat. The back of the chair is the steep upper part of the slope where the mass detaches. The seat of the chair is the near horizontal section at the bottom, running under the reservoir. That flat lower section is the part the water reached, and it is the part where the clay was. None of this was invisible. It is not exotic geology, and it was not beyond the science of the 1950s. Limestone karst, dipping bedding, clay interbeds, and the effect of poor water pressure on a failure plane were all standard material for a competent engineering geologist of the period. The site was studied in 1929, again in 1949, and repeatedly thereafter. The question was never whether the geology could be read. It was what would be done about what it said. At some point, before the movements on the slope began, a young geologist working on the site reached a conclusion about that slope that was different in kind from anything in the project file. His name was Eduardo Semenza. He was born in 1927, and he was the son of Carlos Semenza, the dam's designer. Eduardo Semenza was working as a geologist on his father's project. What he identified there, according to the peer-reviewed account of his work published by the geologist Monica Girotti in 2006, was that an ancient landslide mass was present on the left side of the Vilhjalmur Valley. He found it some years before the first movements began. From geological and geomorphological features on the ground, he was able to define the shape of that ancient mass and the boundary around it. That sentence needs unpacking, because it is the technical heart of the case. A landslide leaves a signature. When a large body of rock detaches and travels downslope, it does not simply vanish into the valley floor. It leaves a scar at the top where it broke away, a lobe at the bottom where it came to rest, and between them, a body of material whose internal structure is wrecked. The bedding planes no longer line up with the surrounding rock. The material is broken and disturbed in ways that intact bedrock is not. And along the surface it slid on. There is a zone of crushed and altered rock produced by the sliding itself. If those features survive, they can be read long afterwards. A geologist walking the ground can map the edges of a slide that happened before any human being was there to see it. That is what Eduardo Semenza did on the left bank of the Vilhjalmur. He concluded that the slope opposite Erto and Casso was not intact mountainside. It was the body of a landslide that had already happened once. The significance of that finding is not that the ground was weak, it is more specific and much worse. A slope that has already failed has a ready-made failure surface inside it. The hard work of breaking a sliding plane through solid rock has already been done by the previous event at some point in the geological past. What remains is a mass sitting on a surface it has already proved it can move along. According to the account by the hydraulic engineer Walter Clem, Eduardo Semenza's assessment was that a landslide from Monte Toc was probable, and probable at roughly the volume that eventually came down. Clem also records that Semenza tried to persuade his father to abandon the project, and did not succeed. Both men were doing their jobs correctly. The geologist read the ground and reported what it said. The engineer had a structure under construction, a concession, a schedule, and an approval that traced back to 1943. The information passed between them. It did not pass into any process capable of stopping the work. The company also brought in an outside expert. Leopold Müller was an Austrian civil engineer and geologist, a lecturer at Karlsruhe, and one of the founding figures of the discipline that studies how rock masses behave as engineering material. He was commissioned by the company as a consultant in 1959. He examined Monte Toc and described a mobile structure on the slope in the shape of an M, and he considered a large landslide possible. The accessible sources do not fix precisely when he first used that description. The M-shaped feature became clearly visible on the ground only after the slide of November 1960, so the dating of his exact wording should be treated with care. What is dated is what he wrote in February 1961. Clem records the passage. "There could be no doubt," Muller wrote, "and the only way to be safe from the more than 200 million cubic meters of rock that threatened to collapse was to give up the project." That is an unambiguous professional judgment, in writing, from the company's own consultant, naming a volume within about 25% of what actually came down 2.5 years later. It was not acted on. By early 1961 then, the state of knowledge looked like this. The dam's designer had a geological assessment from his own son, identifying the slope as an old landslide, capable of moving again, at a volume in the hundreds of millions of cubic meters. The company had a written recommendation from its Austrian consultant to abandon the project for the same reason. The slope had physically moved once, in November 1960, and left a 2-kilometer crack marking out the moving mass. And an Italian court had ruled, in November 1960, that a journalist saying the reservoir was dangerous was neither lying nor exaggerating. 4 separate channels, 4 different kinds of evidence. Geology, engineering consultancy, physical observation, and judicial finding, all pointing the same way. There is one more piece, and it had happened before any of them. On 22 March 1959, at a place called Pontassay, about 10 kilometers from the Vilhjalmur Gorge, something happened that should be part of every account of this story, and usually is not. Pontassay was another dam, part of the same hydroelectric system, operated by the same company. It was smaller. In March 1959, the operators were running fill trials there, with the water level held about 13 meters below its maximum. According to the account published by the Italian magazine Panorama, the water in the reservoir began to discolor, turning a yellowish shade, and underground noises were heard. The operators began an emergency drawdown. As the level came down, the slope accelerated. Roughly 3 million cubic meters of material collapsed into the reservoir in under a minute, and the displaced water produced a wave more than 20 meters high. The plant custodian was a man named Arcangelo Tiziani. He was caught by the water and debris. His remains were never recovered. That was 22 March 1959. Tina Merlin's article about the Vilhjalmur was published on 5 May 1959. 6 weeks separate them. It is important to be careful about what this establishes. It does not prove that the company knew the Vilhjalmur would fail. 2 dams in the same system with similar mountain geology is a meaningful similarity, and one is not the other. What Pontassay establishes is narrower and still substantial. Before the Vilhjalmur reservoir had taken a drop of water, this operator had already watched a slope above one of its alpine reservoirs fail during filling operations, fast, at a scale of millions of cubic meters, killing one of its own employees. Panorama's account records one further detail. In the later judicial proceedings over the Vilhjalmur, Alberico Biadene, the engineer who by then ran the company's hydroelectric division and who would be convicted in 1971, did not acknowledge the earlier incident. Pontassay also demonstrated something specific about the physics, and this is the detail that matters most for what follows. At Pontassay, the slope accelerated during the emergency drawdown. Lowering the water did not immediately calm the mountain. It coincided with the failure. Hold that beside the Vilhjalmur, where lowering the water in late 1960 did slow the movement. The two events point in opposite directions, which is exactly the situation the operators found themselves in 4 years later, when the only tool they had left was the level of the lake. Filling of the Vilhjalmur Reservoir began in February 1960. The way a reservoir of this kind is commissioned is by stages. The water is brought up to a level, held, monitored, and then brought up further. Instruments on the slopes and in the structure record what is happening. The purpose is to find out how the whole system behaves before it is asked to hold its full load. The Vilhjalmur was instrumented. From April 1961, there were piezometers in the slope, devices that measure water pressure inside the rock, designated P1, P2, and P3. Survey benchmarks tracked surface movement. The company was not operating blind. It was operating with data and generating more of it every week. Those two kinds of instrument answer two different questions, and it is worth knowing what each of them could and could not say. A survey benchmark is a fixed marker set into the ground on the slope, whose position is measured repeatedly from stations on stable rock elsewhere. Over weeks and months, the changes in those measurements describe how far a point on the mountain has moved and in which direction. Benchmarks tell you what the surface is doing. They are the reason there are daily displacement figures in this story at all. A piezometer answers the question underneath that one. It is an instrument placed in a borehole to measure the pressure of water inside the rock mass. That pressure is what determines whether a potential sliding surface is being held together by friction or pushed apart. A slope can look entirely unchanged at the surface, while the water pressure inside it climbs toward the point at which it will fail. At the Vilhjalmur, the two sets of readings told a consistent story from 1961 onward. The 2025 research review summarizes it directly. Higher water levels were associated with higher rates of movement, and low levels in the reservoir slowed the displacements down or stopped them altogether. That is about as clean a result as field instrumentation ever produces. There is no ambiguity in it, no need for interpretation, no competing signal. One variable was under the operator's direct control. The other was the stability of a mountain above two villages. They moved together in the expected direction every time. The instruments did their job perfectly. They were installed by people who wanted to know. They measured the right quantities, and they produced an unambiguous answer. What no instrument on that slope could measure was the thing the entire safety case depended on. Benchmarks record how fast a mass is creeping while it is still intact. They cannot tell you how fast it will travel once it stops being intact, because that is a different regime of behavior governed by different physics. There was no instrument at the Vilhjalmur, and there is no instrument now that converts a creep rate into a failure velocity. So the monitoring program was measuring, with great precision, the one thing that did not decide the outcome. The first cycle produced its warnings in order. A minor detachment at about 600 meters in March. Instrument readings of ground movement in May. The 700,000 cubic meter slide in November, and the crack it left behind. Each of those was recorded, and each was followed by a decision to carry on to the next stage. Then, in the weeks after the November slide, the level was brought down to about 600 meters and the movement slowed. At that point, the company possessed a piece of knowledge that it had bought with a landslide. Raise the water and the mountain moves. Lower the water and the mountain slows. The physical reason for this is understood now and was substantially understood then. Water rising against the toe of a slope does two things at once. It reduces the weight, pressing the mass down onto its sliding surface, because submerged rock is effectively lighter. And it raises the water pressure inside the joints and along the failure plane, which pushes the two sides of that plane apart and reduces the friction holding them together. A slope that is stable dry can be marginal wet, and the transition can be narrow. So the reservoir was not simply a store of water. It was a control on the stability of the mountain beside it. The engineers now had a dial. Understand what that meant for the next 3 years. Every decision about the water level from this point forward was, whether it was framed that way or not, a decision about how far to push the slope. The reservoir was full of a resource the company sold, and the slope's stability was inversely related to how much of that resource was in the reservoir. Two things were done in response to the 1960 slide, and each tells you something about what the company by then expected. The first was monitoring. Exploration wells and piezometers were installed to track conditions inside the slope. That is the response of an organization intending to watch a hazard closely. The second is more revealing. In October 1961, the company completed a bypass tunnel connecting the upper and lower reaches of the reservoir. The French state analysis puts its cost at about 1 billion lire. Consider what a tunnel like that is for. If a large mass of the mountain slides into the reservoir, it will land in the middle of it and divide the lake in two. The upstream half would then be cut off from the dam, from the outlets, and from any means of controlling its level. A bypass tunnel is a pipe under the obstruction, so that if the lake is split, water can still be moved from the upper part to the lower part. You do not spend 1 billion lire building that unless you expect the lake to be divided. The wave model belongs in the same category, and it is the more revealing of the two. In 1961, the company commissioned the University of Padua to build a physical scale model of the reservoir in order to study what a slide would do to the water. Landslide-generated waves were, at that date, a young subject. There was no established body of theory that let an engineer calculate the height of such a wave from first principles. The way you found out was to build a small copy of the valley, put water in it, drop a measured mass into it, and see how high the water went. A model like that has to be given its inputs. Somebody has to decide, before the experiment runs, how much material will enter the water, from what height, and above all, how fast. Volume and height can be estimated from the mapped extent of the moving mass and the shape of the slope. Those are geometric quantities, and the site provided them. Speed cannot be estimated that way. Speed is a property of the failure itself, and in 1961, there was no method for predicting it. There is still no complete method. The 2025 research review lists the velocity of the Vilhjalmur slide among the questions the literature has not closed. So the model at Padua could only ever have answered a conditional question. Given a slide of this size, arriving at this speed, the wave will be this high. Change the assumed speed, and the answer changes completely, because the energy delivered to the water rises sharply with velocity. A mass sliding in at walking pace displaces water. The same mass arriving at 90 kilometers an hour launches it. The choice of that one input decided everything the model would report, and it was a choice, not a measurement. The French state analysis records that the results of those model tests, which emphasized the significance of the water level, never reached the testing commissions or the inspection authorities. That means the arm of the Italian state responsible for licensing these works was never able to put the only question that mattered about the model. It could not ask what slide speed the model had assumed or on what basis. This is the point in the story where the project's internal logic becomes visible. and it is not the logic of people who thought the mountain was safe. It is the logic of people who had accepted that a large slide was coming and had decided to manage it rather than avoid it. The plan, in effect, was to let the mountain come down into a reservoir low enough that the resulting wave would be tolerable, and to keep the installation working afterwards through the tunnel. That is not an unreasonable engineering position in the abstract. Large infrastructure regularly manages hazards it cannot eliminate. It becomes unreasonable only when two conditions are added. The first is that the volume estimate is wrong by a wide margin. The second is that nobody tells the people who live below. Both conditions were met. On 17 October 1961, the Vilhjalmur Dam was officially inaugurated. 12 days later, on the morning of Sunday, 29 October 1961, Carlo Semenza suffered a cerebral hemorrhage at his home. He died the following morning, 30 October 1961, in Venice. He was 68 years old. There is nothing in the record connecting his death to the project, and this account will not suggest one. He was 68 and he had a stroke. What his death did was change who was in charge. His role passed to his deputy, an engineer named Alberico Biadene. Track the position carefully, because the shape of this story depends on it. The man who had conceived the Vilhjalmur scheme, who had inspected the gorge as far back as 1929, who had designed the structure, and who had received his own son's geological assessment directly, was gone within a fortnight of the dam's inauguration. Everything after October 1961 was managed by someone who had inherited the mountain rather than chosen it. Biadene had the crack, the consultant's February 1961 letter, the monitoring data, the tunnel, and the schedule. He had not had the 20-year conversation that produced them. He is also the man who, in March 1971, would be convicted. Through the winter of 1961 and into 1962, the reservoir was held between about 580 and 650 meters. The French analysis records that during the severe winter, the fractures on the slope widened by around 6 meters before stabilizing. 6 meters, not 6 millimeters. The crack that marked out the moving block opened by about the width of a road and then stopped, and the project continued. It is worth pausing on what a measurement like that describes. The crack was not a hairline in a wall. It was the surface trace of the boundary between a mass of mountain that was moving and the rock behind it that was not. It ran for something in the order of 2 kilometers around the head of the slope. When the fractures widened by 6 meters over a winter, that is a statement about the whole block. The mass had displaced downslope by roughly that amount, and the gap left behind it recorded the movement. 6 meters in a season on a body of rock measured in hundreds of millions of cubic meters is not a slope settling. It is a slope in motion. Then it stabilized, and the stabilization is exactly as informative as the movement. What had changed in the meantime was the reservoir, which was being held between about 580 and 650 meters, rather than pushed higher. The mountain moved when the water was high and stopped when it was lower, on a scale of meters, in full view of the instruments. By the spring of 1962, the operators had watched this happen twice, at 2 different magnitudes. They had also seen it once at Pontesi, in a different valley, in a way that killed one of their own staff. Everything after that point was done with that knowledge in hand. In 1961, the company also commissioned the University of Padua to build a physical scale model in order to study what would happen if the slope came down into the reservoir. That model was intended to predict the height of the wave a slide would generate. Again, note what commissioning that model concedes. Nobody builds a wave model for a landslide they do not expect. By 1961, the question inside the project was no longer whether Monte Toc would fail. It was how big the wave would be when it did, and whether the reservoir could be operated at a level low enough to absorb it. The French state analysis of the disaster records a finding about that model, and about the geological work that belongs at the center of this story. The testing commissions and the inspection authorities never received the final reports from the geologists, and they never received the model test results emphasizing the significance of the water level. Read that again in terms of the system rather than the individuals. The company had geological assessments identifying an ancient landslide. It had a consultant's written recommendation to abandon. It had wave modeling from a university. It had 4 years of instrument data establishing that the mountain's movement tracked the reservoir level. And the bodies whose statutory job was to inspect the works and authorize their operation did not have those documents. The state was not overruled. The state was uninformed by a process nobody had to conspire to build. Each piece of information was commissioned by the company, delivered to the company, and filed by the company. There was no requirement that it travel any further, and it did not. Which brings the story to the deadline. On 6 December 1962, the Italian Parliament passed Law 1643. It nationalized electricity generation and created a single national body, Enel, to take over the private producers. For most Italians, this was a piece of post-war industrial politics. For the Vilhjalmur project, it was a clock. Nationalization meant that the works in the gorge would pass out of the company's hands and into the states. When a private asset is transferred under a scheme like that, its value has to be established, and the value of a hydroelectric installation is a function of what it can be shown to produce. A dam operating at a restricted level is worth less than a dam operating at its design level. A reservoir that has never been filled to capacity has never demonstrated its capacity. The French state analysis of the disaster records the consequence in a single clause. Ahead of the takeover, the operator was seeking to maximize output. Be precise about the status of that statement. It is a documented finding about an incentive. It is not a finding that the incentive caused the disaster, and this account does not make that claim. What it does is answer a question that otherwise has none. Here was a company that had built a wave model, dug a bypass tunnel, and watched its own slope move for 2 years. Why it then chose to raise the water higher in 1963 than ever before has no other explanation. The reservoir was not only a hazard control, it was also the measure of what the company was about to be paid for. Those two functions pulled in opposite directions, and there was no mechanism anywhere in the arrangement that gave the first of them priority over the second. The second filling ran through 1962. The French analysis records that during this period, there was seismic activity in the area, and that cracks were multiplying in houses in the valley. That is a detail worth sitting with. The people living around the reservoir were not being told that the mountain was moving. They were watching their own walls crack. In late November 1962, the reservoir reached about 700 meters. That was 45 meters higher than the level at which the mountain had slid in 1960. The slope responded. Movement of the mass accelerated to somewhere in the region of 1.2 to 1.5 centimeters per day, depending on which measurement and which source is used. 1.5 centimeters a day is not dramatic to look at. It is roughly the width of a fingernail. Over a month, it is about 45 centimeters, and over a year, it would be more than 5 meters. The mass that was moving at that rate was a substantial part of a mountain. Then, from December 1962 through to March 1963, the level was brought down. The movement slowed. The French analysis records that the seismic activity ceased. That is the rule confirmed for the second time, on a much larger scale than in 1960, with instruments installed specifically to measure it. Raise the water and the mountain accelerates. Lower the water and the mountain settles. 2 full cycles, 2 consistent results. At this point, the company was in possession of an experimentally verified relationship between a variable it controlled completely and a hazard it could not control at all. There is no ambiguity in the data, and there was none at the time. The dial worked. It is worth laying the 3 filling cycles out in order with the numbers, because written as a sequence, they stop looking like a series of technical operations and start looking like what they were. The first cycle ran from February 1960. The water went up through 600 meters in March, past the point where instruments picked up ground movement in May, and continued rising through the summer. On 4 November 1960, at about 645 to 650 meters, 700,000 cubic meters came down. The level was then brought back to about 600 meters, and the movement slowed. Result of Cycle 1. The mountain moves when the water rises. Cost of learning it. 1 slide, no deaths. The second cycle ran through 1962. The level was pushed to about 700 meters in late November, which is 50 meters above the point at which the mountain had slid 2 years earlier. Movement accelerated to somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5 centimeters a day. There was seismic activity in the area, and cracks were appearing in houses in the valley. From December 1962, the level was reduced, and by March 1963, the movement had slowed, and the seismic activity had ceased. Result of Cycle 2. Confirmed, at a larger scale, with the slope now instrumented and the relationship measured rather than inferred. Then the third cycle. From April 1963, the reservoir was filled again. Through the spring and into July, the level was brought up to about 705 meters, higher than the previous peak. Then, during the summer, a period of heavy precipitation pushed it further. It reached about 710 meters, which the American Dam Safety Case Study records as the highest level the reservoir ever held. That put the water surface roughly 15 meters below the crest of the dam. Movement on the slope through this period was measured at over 3 centimeters a day. The third filling is the decision that is hardest to explain, and the one the court spent 8 years on. By April 1963, nothing about the mountain was in doubt. The relationship had been established twice. The consultant's letter recommending abandonment was 2 years old. The wave model existed. The bypass tunnel existed. The crack was mapped, and the reservoir went to its highest level ever, in the year the company was being nationalized. There is a version of this decision that is not reckless, and it deserves to be stated fairly, because it is probably close to what the people making it believed. In that version, the slide is coming and cannot be prevented, but it can be managed. The mass has been creeping slowly for years and is expected to keep creeping slowly. A slow slide into a reservoir displaces water gradually, produces a modest wave, and can be absorbed. The bypass tunnel handles the aftermath. On that reading, the safe move is not to abandon a completed installation. It is to control the descent. Everything in that reasoning depends on one assumption. It depends on the mass coming down slowly. Nothing in the data available in 1963 established that it would. The creep rates showed how fast the mountain was moving while it was still held together. They said nothing about how fast it would move once it stopped being held together. Those are different questions. And the second one was not answered anywhere in the project file. It is still not fully answered now. The 2025 review of 60 years of Vajont research by Rafaela Oliveira Lapa and Gyula Bogoli lists the velocity of the slide among the open problems in the literature. The extreme speed and the way the mass moved as a single body were surprising at the time, and the review states plainly that they remain incompletely understood. That is the gap the third filling was built over. Not a gap in diligence, a gap in the science, which is still open, and which the operators treated as though it had been closed in their favor. In September 1963, the displacement rate on the slope was measured at around 4 centimeters a day. The movement was no longer responding the way it had before. In the earlier cycles, changes in the water level had produced changes in the mountain's behavior with a lag of days to weeks, and lowering the level had reliably brought the rate down. Now the rate was climbing, while the level was high, and it was climbing faster than the level alone accounted for. There was also rain. The week before the disaster brought heavy rainfall, which the French analysis identifies as one of the contributing factors, on the grounds that it added weight to the moving mass and put more water into the sliding plane. So the operators were facing a slope that was accelerating under the combined effect of a high reservoir and a wet autumn, using the only instrument they had. In late September, they began to bring the level down. This is the moment where the story stops being about decisions and starts being about physics, and it is worth being exact about why the drawdown failed, because it is not obvious. Lowering a reservoir does reduce the water pressure at the toe of a slope, but water inside a rock mass does not drain at the speed the lake empties. The lake level can fall in days. The water pressure deep inside a body of fractured limestone and clay falls much more slowly, because the water has to find its way out through the rock. So during a rapid drawdown, there is a period in which the supporting pressure of the lake against the slope has gone, but the internal pressure pushing the failure plane apart has not yet fallen. For a slope that is already close to failing, that period is the most dangerous condition it can be in. This is the same effect that appears in the Pontese record from March 1959, where the slope accelerated during an emergency drawdown and came down in under a minute. The operators of the Vajont, 4.5 years later, were reaching for the same lever. The drawdown did not stop the movement. Through the first days of October, the rate went up. By around 4 October, measurements at the surface benchmarks were recording movement approaching 20 centimeters a day. 20 centimeters a day is a different phenomenon from 1.5 centimeters. It is visible. It is the mountain moving the length of a forearm every day, and it means the mass is no longer creeping. It is running out of whatever was still holding it. The last fortnight can be set out as a sequence of decisions, and doing so shows what the operators still had available at each point. In late September, with the level near its maximum and the rate climbing, the choice was between holding, lowering slowly, and emptying as fast as the outlets allowed. They chose to lower. That was the correct instinct, and, given what Pontese had demonstrated 4 years earlier about rapid drawdown on a marginal slope, it was also the option with a known failure mode. Through the first days of October, the rate rose rather than fell. At that point, the information available said that the control had stopped working. The reservoir was coming down, and the mountain was speeding up, which is the opposite of the relationship established across 2 previous cycles. That reversal is the single clearest signal in the entire record, and it arrived with about a week to spare. It meant the slope was no longer being governed by the water level. It had passed into a regime where its own internal condition was driving it. From that point, the only decisions left were about people rather than water. On 6 October 1963, the road along the lake shore became unusable. On 7 October, trees on the slope were bending and new cracks were appearing. Evacuations began. On 8 October, an evacuation warning was issued and the road to Urto and Kaso was closed. Those 3 days are documented, and they are the closest the record comes to anyone in authority telling the people around the reservoir what was happening. The warnings went to the villages on the shore, the ones directly beside the moving slope. That was a reasonable judgment about who was in danger from a wave crossing a lake. Longarone is not on the lake. Longarone is 200 meters below the lake, on the floor of a different valley, behind a dam that had never failed and was not going to. There is no evidence that Longarone was warned, and there is no evidence that anyone with authority believed it needed to be. Every calculation available to the project concerned a wave inside the reservoir. The question of what would happen if a wave left the reservoir entirely, went over the top of a 261.6 meter dam, and fell into the valley below had not been asked in any document that reached a decision maker. On the evening of 9 October 1963, the reservoir stood at an elevation of about 700.4 meters. 54 people were at the works, including staff in the control room on the structure. At 22 minutes and 39 seconds past 10 in the evening, the mountain came down. The mass that moved was, depending on the source, between about 260 million and 300 million cubic meters. It was roughly 2 kilometers wide, and it broke away as a single body rather than disintegrating. It entered the reservoir in under 45 seconds, at speeds that the technical literature puts at between 20 and 30 meters per second, which is something in the region of 70 to 100 kilometers an hour. It traveled about 300 meters horizontally and stopped against the far side of the gorge, filling the reservoir from the bottom. The reservoir held around 115 million cubic meters of water at that level. Roughly 50 million cubic meters of it were displaced. Water that is displaced has to go somewhere, and in a gorge with vertical rock walls there are only 2 directions available. Half of it went east, up the reservoir, and struck the shore below Urto and Kaso. The other half went west, at the dam. The wave that arrived at the dam rose more than 100 meters above the crest. Estimates vary, and this is one of the genuinely contested figures in the record. The American Dam Safety Case Study and the 2025 Research Review both give a figure above 100 meters. The French State Analysis gives about 150 meters. Britannica gives a range of 150 to 200 meters above the dam. What is not contested is that it went over. Something in the order of 25 million cubic meters of water passed across the top of a 261.6 meter dam and fell into the gorge on the other side. That volume did not arrive in the valley below as a flood. It arrived as a mass of water dropping the height of a skyscraper into a confined space, and it carried the air in front of it. Where the gorge opens into the Piave Valley, about a mile downstream, the flood depth was around 70 meters. At approximately 22:43, 4 minutes after the slide, it reached Longarone. Longarone was destroyed, along with Parago, Rivalta, Villanova, and Faye. On the reservoir shore, Urto and Kaso were struck by the wave that had gone the other way. The 2 halves of the wave killed people in 2 entirely different ways, and the difference explains the shape of the casualty figures. The wave that went east, up the reservoir, was water crossing a lake and striking the far shore. It rose against the slopes below Urto and Kaso and against the small settlements along the reservoir margin. That is a recognizable kind of flood. It came from a direction the residents had been told to worry about. It arrived over open water, and the villages themselves stood high enough on the slope that their centers survived. The official breakdown records 158 deaths in Urto and Kaso and 129 in the hamlets around the reservoir. Downstream, the water did not stop at Longarone. The official breakdown records a further 111 deaths in villages of the Piave Valley. Pirago, Rivalta, Villanova, and Faye were destroyed along with Longarone itself, and the flood continued down the Piave beyond them. That distribution is worth reading as a single figure rather than 5. The wave killed people on the reservoir shore, at the mouth of the gorge, on the valley floor, in settlements strung along a river below, and inside the installation that produced it. It did so within a few minutes, across a stretch of country in which the great majority of those affected had received no warning of any kind, because the warnings that had been issued on 7 and 8 October were addressed to the villages beside the lake. The people in the greatest danger were the ones furthest from the thing everybody was worried about. The wave that went west did something that had no precedent. It did not flow into the valley below. It fell into it. Roughly 25 million cubic meters of water passed over a structure whose crest. What emerged at the bottom was not a river in flood. It was a mass of water and rock moving at the speed that a fall of that height produces, pushing a wall of compressed air ahead of it. By the time it reached the mouth of the gorge, roughly a mile downstream, the flood depth was around 70 meters. Longarone sat directly in front of that opening, on the flat floor of the Piave Valley. The official figure for Longarone is 1,458 dead. The American Dam Safety Case Study gives a different and even starker local statistic, estimating that of 1,328 people in the town who were in the path of the wave, 1,269 were killed. That is a fatality rate of 94% among those exposed. 4 minutes separated the slide from the arrival of the water. It is worth saying plainly what that interval means, because it removes an entire category of what if from this story. 4 minutes is not enough time to warn a town. It is not enough time to telephone anyone, confirm what has happened, decide what to say, and pass it on. At 22:39, the people who might have raised an alarm were themselves inside the event, and 54 of the people at the works, including the control room staff, did not survive it. Whatever could have saved Longarone had to happen before 9 October 1963. It could not happen during it. That is the reason the 1969 verdict, which located the crime in the failure to warn the residents, sat so badly with the physical record. The window in which a warning could have worked was not 4 minutes wide. It was 4 years wide, and it had been open since November 1960. The dam did not fail. It lost part of the parapet along the top. The structure itself, which had just taken a load enormously beyond anything it was designed for, was left essentially intact and is standing in the gorge today. 54 people at the works were killed, including the staff in the control room. That figure deserves a moment, because of what it indicates about belief. The people who knew most about the state of Monte Toc on the evening of 9 October 1963 were the operators. They had the benchmark readings showing roughly 20 centimeters of movement a day. They had watched the road along the shore become unusable on the 6th, and the trees bend on the 7th. They had issued the evacuation warning on the 8th and closed the road to the villages, and on the night of the 9th, 54 of them were at the dam. Some accounts describe personnel being present specifically to observe the slope. Whatever the individual reasons, the fact itself is evidence, and it points in one direction. People do not station themselves and their colleagues on a structure they expect to be destroyed within hours. This is the strongest available argument against reading the Vajont as callousness. The men managing that reservoir appear to have believed their own safety case. They believed the mass would come down slowly, that the wave would be containable, that the dam would hold, and that standing on it was a reasonable place to be while it happened. 2 of those 4 beliefs were correct. The mass came down. The dam held. The other 2 were the ones that mattered, and they were the 2 that no measurement on that slope had ever tested. By first light on 10 October, the shape of what had happened was visible, and the first problem the authorities faced was not repair or rescue, it was counting. The town of Longarone had been on the floor of the valley. What the wave left was a plain of mud and rock where a town had been. There were no buildings to search in the ordinary sense, because in the center of the impact zone there were no buildings. The recovery effort continued for a long time and did not produce a closed number. According to the French state analysis, about 1,600 bodies were recovered, and barely half of them could be identified. The figure most often given as the official Italian death toll is 1,910, and it comes with a breakdown that is worth reading in full, because the geography of the loss explains the shape of the disaster. Longarone, 1,458. Urto and Casso, 158. The hamlets around the reservoir, 129. The villages of the Piave Valley, 111. The works themselves, 54. Of those, 470 were never found at all. Other credible sources give different totals. Britannica gives about 2,000. The 2025 Research Review gives more than 2,000. The American Dam Safety Case Study gives upwards of 2,056. It also gives a different local figure for Longarone. Of an estimated 1,328 people in the town who stood in the path of the wave, it records 1,269 killed, a fatality rate of 94%. The French state analysis gives a range of 1,900 to 2,100. This account will not pick one of those and present it as settled, because they are not reconcilable, and the disagreement itself is informative. The uncertainty is not sloppiness on anyone's part. It is a direct product of what the wave did. A death toll is normally assembled from bodies, from records, and from the accounts of people who knew who was where. In Longarone, the wave removed all 3 at once. It took the population, it took the buildings that held the records, and it took the neighbors who would have known that a family had visitors that night. 947 of the recovered dead could not be given a name. 470 people were never recovered in any form. Those 2 figures, taken together, describe a specific kind of loss that goes beyond the number. A death toll that cannot be closed leaves families without the fact of a death. It leaves an estate that cannot be settled and a burial that cannot be held. It is one of the reasons this event stayed procedurally alive in Italian courts for nearly 40 years. The dam is the part everybody remembers, and it deserves an honest accounting, rather than the version that circulates. The Vajont Dam performed. It was subjected to a combined load from the slide and the overtopping wave that was, in the words of the American Dam Safety Case Study, far in excess of design pressures, and it sustained little damage. As a piece of structural engineering, it is among the most impressive things anybody built in the 20th century. That fact has been turned into a slogan, and the slogan is misleading. It is often said that the dam never failed, as though the concrete were exonerated and something else were to blame. But nothing about the dam was ever the question. The question was always the mountain beside it, and the reservoir was the instrument that acted on the mountain. A dam is a wall, plus the body of water it creates, plus everything that body of water touches. The Vilhjalmur Dam did exactly what it was designed to do, and what it was designed to do was hold 169 million cubic meters of water, 700 meters up a valley whose left bank was an ancient landslide. The structure passed its test. The project failed at a level above the structure, in the part of the work that was supposed to decide whether the structure should exist there at all. That is why the intact dam is no comfort. It states the failure as clearly as anything could. Every part of the problem that could be solved by sums was solved, beautifully. The part that needed somebody to act on what they already knew, at a moment when knowing it did not fit the schedule, was not. Within days, an argument began in Italy about what kind of event this had been, and that argument turned out to matter as much as the engineering. One account held that the disaster was a natural catastrophe. A mountain had fallen. Mountains fall. On this reading, the event was unforeseeable. Nobody was culpable, and the appropriate responses were mourning and relief. The other account held that it was the outcome of a series of human decisions, each of them documented, made by people who can be named, inside a company that held the relevant files. On this reading, the right response was a criminal inquiry. The scholar Wilco Graf von Hardenberg, writing on the disaster, records that this split ran along political lines in the Italian press of the period. Conservative outlets treated the event as natural and unavoidable. The opposition press put it down to human error. Tina Merlin was, by this point, the single most qualified journalist in Italy to speak to that question. She had reported the danger in 1959. She had been prosecuted for it. She had been acquitted, on the record, by a court that examined her claims and found them justified. She had then covered the 1960 slide, and in February 1961, she had published an article asking whether the failure would come slowly or with a terrible crash. That question, printed 2.5 years before the event, is as close as the historical record comes to a person naming the actual alternative that mattered. The whole management strategy on that slope depended on the answer being slowly. The answer was the other one. The article that contains it was published on 21 February 1961, 3.5 months after the November 1960 slide, and in the same month that Leopold Müller put his recommendation to abandon the project in writing. Two people, in the same weeks, reached the same conclusion by different routes. One was the company's own Austrian consultant, working from rock mechanics, who put the threatened volume at more than 200 million cubic meters and advised giving up. The other was a journalist from a farming family in Belluno, with a third-grade education, working from what the villagers told her and what she could see. She asked in a newspaper whether the mountain would come down gradually or all at once. Muller's document went into the company's files. Merlin's question went into a national newspaper. Neither reached anyone with the authority and the willingness to stop the filling. The confidential expert advice and the published warning failed in the same way and for the same reason, which is that there was no process anywhere whose job was to receive them and act. That symmetry is the argument against the comfortable version of this story. in which a brave outsider is ignored by a closed institution. The insider was ignored too. The problem was not who was speaking, it was that nothing was listening. According to Tricani, an interview she gave to French television after the disaster was censored, she had also written a book. She could not find a publisher for it. Sous la pelle vive, which translates roughly as On Living Skin, was not published until 1983, 20 years after the wave. Consider what that means as a fact about how the story was handled. The reporter who got it right in advance, whose accuracy had been certified by a criminal court before the event happened, spent 2 decades unable to place a book about it. The legal process took time to start, and then took a very long time to finish. 4.5 years is a long time for a case in which nobody disputed who ran the works, where they stood, or that the deaths had happened. The delay is worth explaining, because it was neither evasive nor careless. A prosecution of this kind cannot begin until somebody has established what happened. And at the Vilhjalmur, that meant reconstructing the behavior of a mountain over 3 years from an archive that had been assembled by the party under investigation. The material was enormous. Survey records going back to 1960, piezometer readings from April 1961 onward, correspondence between the company, its consultants, and the ministries, geological reports, the Padua model and its assumptions, concession documents reaching back to 1943. Every one of those had to be located, read by people competent to understand it, and set against the others. Then it had to be turned into a finding about what a specific group of engineers knew on specific dates. That is a different exercise from establishing what was true. Something can be demonstrably true in a file and still not be established as known by a named person at a named time, and criminal liability attaches to the second thing. And the ground itself could not be examined because the ground was under the slide. So the investigators were working outward from paper toward a physical event they could not inspect, in a technical field where, as the 2025 review makes plain, the central mechanism is still argued about. 4.5 years is not slow for that. What it did mean is that the first formal public accounting of the disaster began in 1968. By then, the youngest survivors had been children for half a decade, and the oldest witnesses were 5 years further from the night. Criminal proceedings opened on 20 February 1968, 4.5 years after the disaster. 11 people were held responsible. 9 were brought to court, 2 having died in the interval. The trial was not held in Belluno, and it was not held anywhere near the valley. It was moved to L'Aquila, roughly 500 kilometers to the south, in the Abruzzo Mountains. The stated reason was public order and security. The effect of that decision was to hold the hearings about the wrecking of Longarone in a city that most of the survivors could not reach. Whether or not the reasoning was sound, and there were arguments for it, the practical result was that the people with the greatest stake in the outcome were cut off from a case that would run for years. That is a pattern this story has already established. In 1959, the question of whether Monte Toc was dangerous was moved from the valley to a courtroom in Milan. In 1968, the question of who was responsible for what Monte Toc did was moved from the valley to a courtroom in L'Aquila. Both moves were procedurally normal. Both took the matter out of the place where the evidence lived. To understand what the courts spent the next 3 years doing, it helps to be clear about what a prosecutor in a case like this actually has to establish. Nobody was accused of wanting the valley destroyed. That was never the charge, and there is nothing in the record to support it. What was alleged was negligent conduct, which in Italian criminal law, as in most systems, means failing to take the care that the case required and causing harm as a result. Negligence cases divide on a question that sounds academic and is not. There is a difference between failing to notice a danger that you ought to have noticed and noticing a danger and proceeding anyway. The first is ordinary negligence. It covers the engineer who miscalculates, the inspector who does not look, the manager who does not ask. The person is culpable because a competent professional in their position would have seen it. The second is a heavier category. In Italian criminal law, it appears as an aggravating circumstance, applied where the person actually foresaw the event that followed and went ahead regardless, without intending it to happen. It occupies the ground between carelessness and intent. The actor did not want the outcome and did not accept it as their aim. They saw it as possible and proceeded. That distinction is the entire legal history of the Vilhjalmur case. It is also, precisely, the question Tina Merlin had been prosecuted over in 1959, arriving from the opposite direction. One feature of this case made it harder than an ordinary engineering investigation, and it is a direct consequence of the event itself. The physical evidence was buried. When a mass of that size comes to rest, it comes to rest on top of the ground that failed, the lower part of the sliding surface. The section that ran beneath the reservoir where the clay layers were ended up under a few 100 million cubic meters of rock. The instruments installed on the moving block moved with it or were destroyed. The reservoir that had been the experimental apparatus for 3 years was gone, replaced by the thing it had been measuring. Investigators could work from what survived. The upper scar was exposed. Boreholes could be drilled. Records, photographs, survey logs, and the correspondence all existed on paper. Later researchers reconstructed the geometry of the failure surface from those sources. But rebuilding a surface from partial exposure is not the same as reading it directly. That is the most likely reason the shape of the sliding plane is still argued about in the technical literature more than 60 years later. The chair-shaped reading and the bowl-shaped reading are both attempts to infer a surface that almost nobody has ever seen. That uncertainty has a legal consequence as well as a scientific one. A court asking whether the failure was foreseeable is asking what a competent professional could have concluded from the site as it stood before the event. Answering that requires knowing what the site actually was. The event destroyed the best evidence of its own cause, which is a difficulty that recurs in catastrophic engineering failures and has no clean solution. The material available to the prosecution was substantial, and almost all of it had been generated by the company itself. There was the perimeter crack from November 1960, mapped and photographed, marking the edge of a moving mass. There were the piezometer readings from 1961 onward, showing water pressure inside the slope. There were the survey benchmarks and their movement records, which tied the level of the reservoir to the speed of the slope across 2 full filling cycles. There was Leopold Müller's letter of February 1961, telling the company to abandon the project because of more than 200 million cubic meters of rock that threatened to collapse. There was Eduardo Semenza's geological work, identifying the ancient landslide. There was the wave model, built at Padua. There was the bypass tunnel, paid for at around 1 billion lire, to cover a case in which the reservoir was cut in 2 by a slide. And there was the final fortnight, when the slope went from 4 centimeters a day to about 20, and the level was still being trimmed rather than emptied. Set against that is the defense position. and it should be stated properly because it is not frivolous. The people running the project did not believe a sudden slide was coming. They believed they were handling a slow mass, whose descent they could hold in check by keeping the reservoir at a sensible level. That belief fitted everything the mountain had done for 3 years, which was to creep. The wave model existed to size what a controlled descent would do. The bypass tunnel existed to keep the works running afterwards. On this account, the failure was not a decision to accept 2,000 deaths. They got the speed of a landslide wrong, in a corner of science that, as the 2025 review confirms, is still not fully understood more than 60 years later. That defense has real force. It also has a hole in it, and the hole is the thing the courts kept returning to. If the whole plan depended on the mass coming down slowly, and nobody could establish that it would, then the people below the dam were carrying a risk that had never been sized. They had not been told they were carrying it. The first verdict came on 17 December 1969, 6 years and 2 months after the wave. The court at L'Aquila convicted 3 men, Alberico Biadene, Bettini, and Violin, and sentenced each to 6 years. The offense was culpable homicide. The basis of the conviction was the failure to warn the residents, and the central accusation that the event had been foreseeable was dismissed. Read those 2 findings together, because the combination is strange and consequential. The court held that these men were criminally responsible for the deaths because they did not warn people. It also held that the disaster was not established as foreseeable. Taken at face value, the 1969 judgment describes a peculiar world. In it, the operators had a duty to warn the population about something that the court was not prepared to say they could have predicted. It made silence the crime and left the decision to fill the reservoir standing. That mattered for reasons far beyond sentencing. If foreseeability was not established, then the years of raising the water were not, legally, a decision to run a known risk. They were a technical exercise that ended badly. The 1969 court left the operational history of the reservoir intact as a matter of law and located the wrongdoing in the final days, in the failure to knock on doors. For the survivors, that finding was worse than the sentences. It said that what happened to Longarone was, in the eyes of the state, a failure of communication. There is a further problem with it, and it is arithmetical. A conviction for failing to warn implies that a warning would have made a difference. Set that against the timeline the physical evidence establishes. The slide began at 22:39. The water reached Longarone at about 22:43. There is no warning that can be conceived, issued, transmitted, and acted on inside 4 minutes across a valley, at night, in 1963, to a town of that size. If the failure to warn was located in those 4 minutes, the conviction describes an impossibility. If it was located earlier, in the days from 6 to 8 October, when the road closed and the trees bent and the villages beside the lake were told to leave, a different problem arises at once. On the project's own analysis, there was no reason for the operators to warn Longarone at all. Longarone was not beside the lake. Nothing in the project's own analysis identified it as being at risk, because the project's own analysis had never modeled a wave leaving the reservoir. And if the failure to warn was located earlier still, in 1961 or 1962, when the mountain was moving meters in a season and the bypass tunnel was being built for a slide the operators expected, then the court is describing a duty that existed for years. But a duty to warn people for years about a hazard is not really a duty to warn. It is a duty not to run the hazard, which is the foreseeability question the 1969 court had just declined to decide. The verdict was internally unstable. That instability is the reason it did not survive the appeal. The appeal was heard at L'Aquila and decided on 3 October 1970. The appeal court reversed the position on the central question. Biadine and Sensidoni were found guilty in relation to the failure to foresee the landslide. Biadine received 6 years and Sensidoni 4 years and 6 months, with 3 years remitted in each case. Several of the other defendants were acquitted. So within 10 months, the same city produced 2 courts that took opposite views of the most important fact in the case. One held that the slide had not been shown to be foreseeable. The other held that the failure to foresee it was the offense. That is not a scandal, and nobody was being foolish. It is what happens when a legal system meets a technical record that supports more than one honest reading. The survey data showed a slope answering to the reservoir level in a way that no competent engineer could have missed. The same data did not show and could not show that the mass would arrive at 100 kilometers an hour. Whether those two facts together amount to foreseeing the event depends on what you decide the event was: a landslide into the reservoir or a wave over the dam. That distinction is the whole case, so it is worth setting the two versions side by side. Suppose the event is a large landslide entering the Vilhjalmur reservoir. Read that way, nobody can seriously argue the slide was unforeseen. The company had mapped the moving block. It had measured how far that block traveled, month by month, for 3 years. It had been told in writing to abandon the project because of it. It had paid Padua to model the wave. And it had spent about 1 billion lire on a tunnel whose only job was to keep the works running after the lake had been cut in two. No company does those 4 things about an event it does not expect. Now suppose the event is a wave overtopping a 261.6 meter dam and wrecking a town on a different valley floor. Read that way, the question is genuinely contested, because it requires the slide to arrive fast enough to launch the water rather than push it aside, and the speed of the failure was the one number nobody could calculate. The 1969 court appears to have been reasoning about the second definition and found the case not made out. The 1970 appeal and the 1971 cassation reasoned about the first and found that the men running the project had foreseen the slide. That is the legally decisive move, and it is defensible. Once you have foreseen that a mountain will enter your reservoir, the burden of establishing that the consequence will be survivable for the people below sits with you. Uncertainty about how bad it will be is not a defense for proceeding. It is the reason not to. The cassation's formulation puts the obligation where the knowledge was. The final decision came from the Corte di Cassazione, the highest court in the Italian system, sitting as its 4th criminal section on 25 March 1971. The judgment is reported in Il Foro Italiano. The court convicted, and the name it gave the offense is the reason this story is worth 2 hours of anyone's attention. Inondazione aggravata dalla previsione dell'evento. Flooding, aggravated by foresight of the event. That formula is not used for a lapse of care. It is what Italian law reaches for in the heavier category, the one that sits above ordinary fault. By applying it, the court went past the question of what a competent professional should have anticipated. It held that the outcome was anticipated in fact, and that the work went forward anyway. The sentences were smaller than the finding. Biadine received 5 years, with 3 remitted. Sensidoni received 3 years and 8 months, with 3 remitted. Dino Tonini was acquitted on the ground that the act did not occur as charged. Accounts of what was actually served differ, and this is one of the disputed points in the record. Walter Klem's account states that Bayadine served about 2 years of a 4.5-year sentence and was released for good conduct, and that Sensidoni served only a few months before being hospitalized and then released. The French state analysis refers to 5 years commuted to 1. The cassation figures are the ones above. What every version agrees on is the shape. Of the 11 people originally held responsible, 2 went to prison, and neither of them for long. That is the arithmetic of it. Between roughly 1,900 and 2,100 people died. 2 men served time, one of them for a period measured in months. Now put the 2 proceedings side by side, because this is the thing the record does that no one designed. In 1959, the Italian state brought a criminal charge against Tina Merlin. To succeed, it needed to establish that her claim about the danger at Vajont was false, exaggerated, or slanted. That is a question about what could responsibly be believed about Monte Toc before anything had happened. On 30 November 1960, the Tribunal of Milan answered it. The article contained nothing false, nothing exaggerated, nothing tendentious. She had exercised her rights as a journalist. The concern she reported in Urto was widespread and justified by the circumstances. In 1971, the Italian state, through its highest court, convicted the men who ran the project of an offense whose aggravating element is that they foresaw the event. Both proceedings turned on the same underlying question. What was knowable about that mountain in advance? The Italian state asked it twice, 11 years apart, in 2 different courts, about 2 different sets of defendants, for 2 completely different purposes. Both times it gave the same answer. The danger was knowable. The first time, that answer acquitted the woman who said so. The second time, it aggravated the sentences of the men who did not act on it. Between those 2 answers, the state had every opportunity to act on its own conclusion, and did not, because there was no route from a criminal acquittal in Milan to an engineering decision in a gorge 400 kilometers away. Those are separate systems. Nothing connected them. The finding of the 1960 court was a finding about a newspaper article, and it stayed a finding about a newspaper article. That is the mechanism at the center of this story, and it is more troubling than a cover-up would be. A cover-up requires someone to decide to hide something. Here, nobody had to. The information existed, it was accurate, it was tested in open court, it was upheld, and it still had nowhere to go. The criminal case ended in 1971. The question of who would pay took another 29 years. On 3 December 1982, the Court of Appeal in Florence ordered damages. On 17 December 1986, the Supreme Court upheld that ruling. Those 2 dates are 23 years after the wave, and they represent the point at which the civil liability was settled in principle rather than in practice. Payment came later still. On 15 February 1997, Montedison, the company that had absorbed the successor to the original concessionaire, compensated Longarone with 55.66 billion lire. The national electricity body compensated the municipalities of Urto, Casso, and Vajont with a combined 1.481 billion lire. The gap between those 2 1997 figures is worth noting. Longarone received 55.66 billion lire. Urto, Casso, and Vajont received 1.481 billion between them. That is a ratio of roughly 38 to 1. There is nothing irregular in it. Compensation in a case like this is calculated from deaths and from destroyed property, and by both measures Longeron's loss was far greater. The town was on the valley floor in front of the gorge. It took the full weight of the falling water, and it was erased. Urto and Casso were struck by a wave crossing a lake. They lost 158 people, rather than nearly 1,500, and their buildings largely stood. What a calculation on that basis does not capture is the other kind of loss on the reservoir shore. The residents of Urto and Casso had been expropriated from their land in the 1950s to make the reservoir. They had objected, and their objection was the source of the warning that entered print in May 1959. They were the community whose reported fear an Italian court examined in 1960 and found justified. They were then told to evacuate on 8 October 1963, and the valley they had been moved off in the first place was permanently filled by the mountain. Those things do not convert into a figure, and no legal process was ever going to make them. Then, in 2000, 37 years after the event, the Court of Cassation confirmed liability and set the compensation. The total came to 900 billion lire. It was divided into 3 equal shares. 1/3 was paid by the National Electricity Body, which had inherited the works. 1/3 was paid by Montedison, which had inherited the company, and 1/3 was paid by the Italian state. That last third is worth stopping on, because it is the state's own accounting of its role. The Italian state was not the operator. It did not raise the water level in 1963. It did not commission the wave model, or build the bypass tunnel, or receive Leopold Muller's letter. On the face of it, it was the party that prosecuted the men responsible, and it could have positioned itself simply as the enforcer of the law against a private company. Instead, it accepted 1/3 of the bill. The reasons are not hard to find in the record already laid out. The state granted the concession. The state approved the project in 1943 through a commission that did not have its required quorum. The state approved the enlargement in June 1957 that nearly tripled the reservoir and raised the dam by 61 meters. And, according to the French state analysis of the disaster, the state's own testing commissions and inspection authorities never received the geologists' final reports or the wave model results. That last point is the crucial one, and it cuts both ways. It is a finding that the regulator was not given the documents. It is also a finding that the regulatory system had no reliable way of ensuring that it got them. A supervisory arrangement that depends entirely on the supervised party volunteering its own adverse findings is not supervision. It is a filing procedure. By accepting 1/3 of the liability, the Italian state was, in substance, agreeing that a public authority which fails to know what it is required to know is not thereby excused. In 2011, Italy designated 9 October a National Day of Remembrance for environmental and industrial disasters. In 2013, on the 50th anniversary, the President of the Senate apologized at Longeron. In 2019, President Sergio Mattarella apologized on behalf of the Italian state. 56 years passed between the wave and the head of state, saying that the country was sorry. There were people at that 2019 apology who had been children in the valley in 1963 and were then in their 60s. An apology at that distance does a particular and limited kind of work. It cannot restore anything, and it does not pretend to. What it does is settle the question that the 1969 verdict left open, and that the 1971 judgment answered only in legal language. It puts on the public record that this was something done to the valley rather than something that happened to it. Tina Merlin did not live to hear it. She kept working. She had reported the expropriations, the danger, the 1960 slide, and the disaster itself. She had asked in print, in February 1961, whether the collapse would come slowly or with a terrible crash. She had been acquitted by a court that examined her reporting and found it justified. After 1963, she wrote the book. Sulla Pelle Viva sets out how the catastrophe was constructed, and its subtitle says exactly that this is how a catastrophe is built. She could not get it published. According to Treccani, an interview she gave to French television was censored. The book did not appear until 1983. She died in 1991, at the age of 65. Consider the timing against the legal record. The cassation gave its judgment in 1971. Her book came out in 1983. She died in 1991. The final compensation ruling came in 2000, 9 years after her death. The state apology came in 2019, 28 years after her death. She was right in 1959, certified as right in 1960, published in 1983, and vindicated by the state in stages that ran for a further 28 years after she was gone. There is no version of that sequence in which the system worked. It is worth being clear that the case against her was not an outrage of a spectacular kind. She was not imprisoned. She was not silenced by force. She was charged, tried, and acquitted, which is the criminal justice system doing what it is supposed to do. The failure was not in the courtroom. The failure was that a country capable of correctly adjudicating whether the Vajont was dangerous had no way of transmitting its own conclusion to the people filling the reservoir. More than 60 years on, several of the central technical questions about what happened on that slope have not been resolved. The 2025 review of Vajont research by Lapa and Bugully sets out where the disagreements sit, and they are not marginal. The first is whether the 1963 event reactivated a prehistoric landslide, or whether it was a first-time failure of intact rock. Eduardo Semenza's identification of an ancient landslide mass on the left bank is one of the foundational readings of the site, and it remains contested in the literature. The second concerns the shape of the surface the mass slid on. One interpretation describes a chair-like geometry, with a steep upper section and a near horizontal lower one. Another describes a bowl-shaped surface. The difference is not cosmetic. The two shapes produce materially different stability calculations, which means that the question of how close that slope was to failing at any given reservoir level depends on which geometry is correct. The third concerns the clay. The failure surface ran largely within the Fonsasso Formation, in cherty limestone layers interleaved with lenses of clay. Whether those clay layers were continuous or broken up, and whether they were at their peak strength or already reduced to the lower residual strength that clay reaches once it has been sheared, is unresolved. A continuous clay layer at residual strength is a very different object from scattered clay lenses at peak strength. The fourth concerns the trigger. 3 readings compete: heavy rainfall in the preceding period, the reservoir operations, or the two acting together. And the fifth is the one that matters most for the deaths. The review states that the extreme velocity of the slide and the fact that the mass moved as a single body were not only surprising at the time, but remain incompletely understood to this day. That is the sentence to hold on to, because it retrospectively describes the exact hole in the 1963 management strategy. The whole plan rested on the mass coming down slowly. The science that would have told anyone whether it would come down slowly did not exist in 1963. It does not fully exist now. The people running the project treated an open question as though it had been answered in their favor. That is the failure, stated as precisely as the evidence allows. Not greed, not indifference, not a conspiracy. A decision to build a safety case on the one variable nobody could calculate, and to keep the people who would bear the consequence from knowing the case existed. The Vajont has not become history in the sense of being finished with. It has become a working document. The Association of State Dam Safety Officials maintains it as a case study in its collection of dam failures and lessons learned, which is material used by the people who regulate dams in the United States. The 2025 review by Lapa and Boegeli exists because researchers are still publishing on the site 60 years after the event, and it exists specifically to map where the disagreements still are. Both of those facts describe an event that continues to be professionally useful, which is a strange and slightly cold thing to say about the destruction of a town, and it is also the most durable good that came out of it. What the case teaches is not primarily geological. The geology of dipping limestone with clay interbeds above a reservoir was understood well enough in 1960 to have stopped the project. What the case teaches is about the architecture of decisions. It shows what happens when the measurement of a hazard and the exploitation of an asset are controlled by the same organization, with no external body holding the underlying data. It shows what happens when a safety case rests on a quantity that cannot be measured, and that gap is filled by an assumption rather than a limit. It shows what happens when an approval granted in one decade is executed in another without being reopened. And it shows what happens to a warning when the only institution that formally examines it is a criminal court examining the person who gave it. None of those failures is exotic. Every one of them is available today, in any country, in any sector where the party generating the safety data is the party that profits from the answer. The dam is still there. It stands in the gorge, 261.6 meters of concrete, curved in two directions, with a road across the top of it. Behind it, there is no reservoir. There is the mountain, which came to rest where the water used to be and has stayed there for more than 60 years. Longarone was rebuilt on the valley floor. Erto and Casso are still on the shore of something that is no longer a lake. The slide came to rest where the reservoir had been, and it has not moved since. What had been 115 million cubic meters of water is now the body of Monte Toc, filling the gorge from the dam eastward, its surface roughly level with where the water used to be. The villages that were told to evacuate on 8 October 1963 look out over it. They were the settlements the warnings were addressed to. They lost 158 people, and they were the only communities in the valley whose residents had been telling anyone for years that the mountain was unsafe. The dam still holds nothing back. The outlets are intact, the arch is intact, and the road runs over the crest, but there is no water for any of it to work on. It is a complete and functional piece of machinery attached to nothing. The counting was never finished. The official figure is 1,910, with 470 people never recovered. Other credible sources put the total above 2,000. Of the roughly 1,600 bodies that were recovered, barely half could be given a name. That is where this ends, and it should end there rather than somewhere tidier, because the incompleteness is the accurate result. What can be stated with confidence is narrow and heavy. A journalist published a warning on 5 May 1959. She was prosecuted for it. On 30 November 1960, a court examined the warning and found it justified, 26 days after the mountain first moved. The reservoir was filled twice more. On 9 October 1963, the slope came down at a speed nobody had calculated, and the wave went over a dam that did not break. And on 25 March 1971, the highest court in Italy convicted the men who ran the project of flooding, aggravated by foresight of the event. The state established that the danger was knowable in 1960 and again in 1971. In the 11 years between those two findings, there was no mechanism anywhere in Italy by which the first one could reach the gorge. That is the part of this story that has not aged. The information was not missing. It was not suppressed by anyone who had to make a decision to suppress it. It was correct, it was public, it was tested in court, and it was upheld, and it was in the wrong building.